Heathens. Welcome to another episode. I am super excited to have Dr. Dan McClellan, the one, the only, TikTok's favorite historian, with us today. I guess actually, Dan, would you consider yourself a historian, a theologian?
I would probably consider myself a historian before a theologian. History is one of the things I do, but I kind of incorporate a number of different disciplines. I generally describe myself as a biblical scholar.
Fair enough, yeah. So I was fortunate enough to find Dan on TikTok. It must have been about a little less than a year ago now, because you've been on TikTok for about a year. And he is doing the really important work of democratizing scholarship and of putting really complicated concepts in ways that people can understand. So if you go to his TikTok page, which we will certainly link, he talks about literally everything you could imagine from the Bible and debunks a lot of craziness that you see floating around TikTok. It's wild. And I can only imagine, as someone who actually has all of the training and schooling, that it's even wilder to see some of this. Like, where does this come from? What are y'all smoking? Because I would like that. So, Dan, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, your research, your hobbies, whatever you want.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate your time. And so I have quite a sordid background. I was born in the mountains in West Virginia a long, long time ago, and I've kind of moved around quite a bit.
This feels like the start of a Stephen Curtis Chapman song.
I'm an awful songwriter, though, so it wouldn't be an entertaining song. And I have when I was 20 years old, I was living in Dallas, Texas, and through a series of events, found myself seeking baptism in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And a year after that, I left and served as a missionary in Uruguay for 2 years. And between getting baptized and leaving as a missionary, I realized that I was well behind everybody else I was going to be serving as a missionary alongside. And so I thought, I need to read the Bible. I need to get to know these texts. And so read all of what Latter-day Saints call the standard works, the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price over the next year. And then got out into the mission field and found out I was now way ahead of most of the folks who are out there. But as a missionary in South America, trying to learn a new language, trying to understand a new culture, and trying to love people who viewed the world very differently from the way I did, and experienced the world very differently from the way I did. I fell in love with studying other cultures and other languages. I fell in love with studying the Bible and the languages involved. I tried to teach myself Hebrew while I was out there, and that did not go well. But I returned home and managed to trick my way into Brigham Young University, where I majored in ancient Near Eastern studies. And I focused on biblical Hebrew, but did a minor in classical Greek as well. And then I went off to Oxford with my wife and 9-month-old daughter at the time, and did a master's degree in Jewish studies, and then moved up to Washington State to an adorable little town just south of the Canada border called Bellingham. Lived there for a bit and did another master's degree in biblical studies, and then came back to Utah with now 2 daughters in tow, and got a job as a scripture translation supervisor for the LDS Church here, and managed to find a way to sneak in a PhD along the way with a 3rd daughter in tow. So my wife and I our hands are full with 3 little girls. Well, I guess 1 little girl, 1 10-year-old, 1 13-year-old, who are quite precocious and giving us a lot to do. But they're phenomenal, and I now still have I'm coming up on 10 years working as a scripture translation supervisor for the LDS Church, and have been publishing and writing. I've got my doctoral dissertation was on cognitive science of religion, cognitive linguistics, and the Conceptualization of Deity in the Hebrew Bible, and that is going to be published as a book the end of this year, beginning of next year, and I'm working on a couple other books. I started up TikTok almost a year ago. It'll be a year on the 30th, and I've been learning a lot about trying to accommodate biblical scholarship, which can sometimes be very complex, for a general audience. And I'm also discovering that I would rather write and present to a general audience than to the academy for a handful of different reasons. But so I'm working on a more popular book right now that will address the evolution of the God of the Bible from its earliest recoverable states to up to, I think, about Nicaea is where I will end it, and hopefully that will be a wonderful resource for a general audience who's looking to better understand what God is like in the Bible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I do want to get into your dissertation research, but before we do that, I have to ask, can you give us a little bit of information on sort of the earliest recoverable form of the biblical God?
So that's, the earliest we can go is... Yeah. There are only a handful of books that have been written to try to answer that, but
60 seconds or less, right?
Yeah. We use a lot of comparative data from other cultures to try to fill in the gaps. So I use the Jurassic Park analogy a lot. They use frog DNA to fill in the gaps in the dinosaur DNA. There's a lot that we do not understand about early Israel. However, we do have some more texts, some more material remains from surrounding cultures. Some of the cultures that provide us the most data come from Ugarit, which was destroyed around 1200 BCE, so right as Israel is coming on the map, and then from Mesopotamia, Babylon and Assyria. And what we can do with this material is kind of try to fill in those gaps, reconstruct to some degree what deity was like, because there are a number of points of contact and overlap. For instance, in the Bible, you have kind of two general divine profiles that are represented, and one seems to orbit around this conceptualization of God as kind of an elderly, patriarchal, high deity that is benevolent and associated with blessing and with fertility and things like this. And the other is a divine profile associated with a youthful, ferocious storm deity who is a warrior. And we can connect these two divine profiles with two figures from the Ugaritic literature, the high deity El, and one of the offspring of El, Baal, the Northwest Semitic storm deity. And by understanding better these two divine profiles, we can connect some dots in the biblical text. And what we see is change along the way as Israel develops. They probably started off with El as their patron deity, and somewhere along the way, and there are a number of books that are trying to pinpoint exactly how this happened. In fact, one of the better ones that I've seen recently, Daniel Fleming's book, Yahweh Before Israel, Glimpses of History and a Divine Name, is a wonderful discussion of what the data suggest the God of Israel's original profile was like and how they may have developed. But we see Adonai, which is what I generally refer to the Tetragrammaton by, coming in as kind of a storm deity, second-tier deity under the high deity El, but at some point was conflated with the high deity El, and through the vast majority of the Hebrew Bible, it's the two of them together. But there are some cracks, some seams in the literature where we get a glimpse of what it might have been like earlier. And the one I usually point to is Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, where you have the Song of Moses, where the Israelites are being criticized and condemned, and the person singing the song tells them to go ask their fathers and their forefathers, and they will tell them that in the days when Elyon, the Most High, divided up the nations and distributed the peoples, he did so according to the number of the children of God. And Adonai's portion was Jacob, Israel was his inherited share. And what this on the surface seems to indicate is that Adonai first came by possession or their relationship with Israel, inheriting it from the high deity El. So this suggests the separation of the two deities, but it's just vague enough that it could be very easily reread. And there were some tweaks along the way textually to make it a little easier to read this as a reference to a single deity. And then you have later texts like Deuteronomy 4:19, which was likely written centuries later, that shifts the positions and talks about the sun, the moon, and the stars as deities, that all the other nations of the earth worshiped them, and that Adonai distributed them to the nations. And so this is kind of a reflection of what's going on in Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9, but a position where Adonai is the one in the position of distributing the nations. So it can be very complex trying to tease apart what is earlier and what is later and what these earlier texts might have meant, and which is one reason that some people find it difficult to believe that Deuteronomy 32:8 originally meant that. But
yeah, I can't speak for scholars, but I think large portions of the population find it hard to believe that two chapters next to each other could have been written at different points in time. Which, I get it. I grew up evangelical, so it was like, nope, this is a historical narrative. One follows the next, and that's it. And I'm just going to make it make sense. That's it. I know what I need it to mean, so I'm just going to force it right in. That's all super fascinating. I'm looking forward to, hopefully one day reading some of those books after I've read the 500,000 on my shelf that I haven't yet gotten. But speaking of books, I was very fortunate for you to have sent me the rough draft, but one of the drafts of your book that's coming out, which focuses on divine agency and the concept of deity in the Hebrew Bible. Mm-hmm. I know what all of those words mean individually, as I assume most of my audience does, but maybe you can provide a little clarity on that topic, like if we were, 5.
5 might be tricky, but I'll see what I can do.
25.
Okay, 20. That 25 gives me a little more to work with there. So the main research question that the book is addressing is one that has bothered scholars for a while, but has not been well known outside of the academic community. And this is the issue of divine images. In a lot of these cultures at Ugarit, in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, and elsewhere, divine images, idols, they are referred to both as if they were the deity and as if they were not the deity. And scholars have been struggling with how to understand this for a long time. And there are a bunch of different frameworks that have been explored. Artistic representation, concepts of mimesis, and other complex things. It always comes down to some weird ontological idea of being that they just understood differently from us. And I wanted to explore this question through the methodological lens, or the discipline of the cognitive science of religion, which tries to understand all of the elements of what we call religion through research in the cognitive sciences, through empirical testing, psychological research, and things like that. And what I found some interesting parallels between the way that people seem to talk and think about divine images, and the way anciently, and the way people seem to talk and think about headstones or tombstones today. And I wanted to explore why there seemed to be so much of a relationship, because they even appear the same. When you look at some of the standing stones that functioned as divine images in the ancient world, they are indistinguishable from how you might imagine they would create a headstone anciently. And looking into the cognitive science, it turns out there's a ready explanation for what's going on here. And it has to do with the way human evolution has structured our minds to think about agents in the world around us. So not just people, but anything that might have a mind and that might, for whatever reason, be focused on us or concerned with us. And this starts way back before humans developed, where the animal in the woods that heard rustling in the bushes, the one that more quickly assumed this could be something with teeth and claws that might be looking at me,
right,
was going to more consistently pass on their genes than the one that initially thought that's just the wind. And so what this did over millions and millions of years evolutionarily was select for people who are more sensitive to the presence of agency in the world around us. And because there is a very big difference in the costs associated with false positives and false negatives, false positive, maybe, it is the wind and you think it's something coming to get you. Maybe somebody makes fun of you. False negative, you think it's the wind and it is something that's coming to get you, you die. So because of that big disparity, there wasn't really much of a ceiling to the evolution of that sensitivity. And so we all are born with, and it develops throughout infancy and into adulthood, hypersensitivity to the presence of agency in the world around us. And that's manifested in a number of ways. The slightest cues can make us feel the presence of things around us. So this is why scary movies are so fun for some people, because you might be in the basement and you come up the stairs and turn the light off and want to get on the other side of that door a little quicker. Or, you sense there might be something in the dark corners or something like that. Yeah. And that's that part of our brain that is trying to protect us and is very willing to make us imagine things that are out there, even if they're not out there, if that protects us. And so as we develop in our infancy and get a better understanding of ourselves, there are some realizations that we come up with intuitively. For instance, our thoughts are internal to us. We can hide them from other people. We can deceive other people about our thoughts. And that contributes to this notion that the self is interior and that the body is not the same as the self. If I can pretend to be one way, but my thoughts are an entirely different way, intuitively, as a child growing up, you kind of distinguish the self from the body. And this is why, and so the self is not actually connected to a body. And there are a number of different ways that this is manifested. In childhood, for instance, about 25% of children in primary school develop imaginary friends. Right. Because they create this other entity, this other agent who does not have a body, but they can engage with it. Sometimes they know it's not real. Sometimes they don't. And this contributes to, and this stays with us throughout adulthood. And so this is why every society that has ever been documented all around the world has concepts of ghosts and spirits and deities and ancestors. And one of the other things critically that contributes to this is when loved ones or kin, our relations, pass away, those cues that helped us know whose presence we were in, a smell, certain type of clothing, pictures, objects, things like that, our brain doesn't just turn that off when they die. Those things still trigger that sense of presence. And so the sense of the presence of a deceased loved one is something that is real, that happens for humans all across the world and throughout time. And that has contributed to the notion that they are out there somewhere. They are among these agents that may be anywhere out there in the world, influencing the world. And when we think about, if you've ever seen a movie or TV show or done it yourself, if you've seen somebody visiting a grave, maybe they talk to the headstone as if it's to the person, because there's an intuitive sense this headstone represents the person. Maybe it has their name on it. Intuitively, that becomes kind of the index or the symbol for that person. And so it just feels natural to talk to it as a representative of that person, even though we know they're not there. And this is precisely the same thing, the same logic that is responsible for divine images. the deity, they're out there somewhere, but we can set up this image. Maybe it looks like them, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it has their name on it. Maybe we've gone through this elaborate ritual to endow their presence in this object. But because personhood can be partible and permeable, according to our intuitive cognition, it is perfectly natural for people to set up some kind of representation of an entity that they can't see, that is not physically there with them, if that entity is important enough.
Right.
So going through I kind of developed this theoretical framework. This is how divine images work. And then I move into talking about the Hebrew Bible, the conceptualization of deity therein, how Adonai is not an exceptionally unusual deity. They are a perfectly normal deity. They do all the things that deities normally do. They tag all of the bases, including with divine images. And so the second half of the book is about the different ways that Adonai's presence is materially manifested. And one of those ways, for instance, is the Ark of the Covenant, which in some of the earliest literary layers is treated as a divine image. The probably best example of that is the battle with the Philistines, the so-called Ark narrative, where they bring it out as a war palladium. It is kind of the banner, the representation of the deity that they bring out before the army to show our deity is with us. And it freaks the Philistines out. They say gods have come into their camp. But the Philistines end up winning the battle, and in the book I argue that it is because they were not authorized to use the ark to bring the deity's presence into the battle. They don't go ask if they should go to battle. They just kind of assume they should, and so that's an inappropriate use of the divine image. But the Philistines take it, and they treat it exactly as they would a captured divine image. They take it back to their temple. They put it in their temple right next to the divine image of their patron deity. And then they engage in a battle of divine images where Dagon, the statue, is fallen over the next day, and they set it back up. And then the day after that, it's fallen over, but now its head and its hands are severed. And it's a way to say these two divine images fought, Adonai's divine image won. And which
one of you fools did this overnight? So, who's responsible for this?
Well, and we get in later apocryphal texts. They have divine images in temples that are supposed to be eating food and things like that, and somebody's suspicious, and so they sprinkle sand all over the floor, and they come out the next day. The food is gone, but they see all the footsteps of the footprints of the priests coming out to take the food. Yeah, so
not gonna trick me.
But this reflects the fact that the Ark of the Covenant functions precisely as a divine image. And if we compare it to other artifacts from the ancient world, there are many that do the exact same thing and even look the same. You know, they're designed to carry things. They're held on poles. They're carried before the army and things like that. And so I argue it's probably best understood as a miniature model shrine or temple, so like a miniaturized temple, and it would have had miniature divine images within it. And in the ancient Judah and Israel, standing stones were the standard divine image, and they would have had the name written on it. And some places in Deuteronomy and Joshua, you have the text of the law written on standing stones, and that facilitates worship before Lifnei Adonai, before the Lord, which is technical terminology that is usually used to refer to being in the temple. But if a standing stone with the text of the law written on it functions as a divine image, little tablets of the law would function as miniature divine images. So a model shrine with little tablets of the law shaped like little miniature standing stones inside it would exactly match how model shrines functioned in the world around Israel. And so I argue that it's probably best understood as a model shrine.
Huh.
And then there are a handful of other ways that the deity's presence is manifested through material means. The messenger of the Lord is one where they take this angel basically, but in several places the angel's identity seems to be mixed up with God's own identity. So Exodus 3, for instance, where Moses runs into, verse 2 says, the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in the flame of fire in the bush. The entire rest of the chapter treats the angel as God themselves. It's verse 5 or 6. The angel says, I am the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And that's explicitly self-identifying as God. And you see this with Gideon, you see this with Manoach and his wife, you see it with Hagar, where you can't tell if it's the angel or God themselves. And the funny thing about all these stories is if you just pluck out the word angel, they tell perfectly normal stories about a God visiting and interacting with somebody. And so most likely these were early stories about Adonai physically interacting with people, and somebody wrote in Malach in a couple of places. But and what that does is kind of creates this situation where this representative is manifesting the divine presence. So where it would normally be an inanimate standing stone or divine image, now we've got this sentient anthropomorphic being, but functioning the same way, functioning to presence the deity. And then once you get into the exile, there's no more temple. There's no more Ark of the Covenant. The divine images are gone. And I argue that the priesthood, or at least the priestly families that are in the exile, trying to reason through what has happened and how we can maintain the worship that has been so important to us, but has also been critical to our structuring of power, our access to power as a priestly guild. And they come up with a couple of different things that allow them to carry on facilitating divine presence. And one of those things is, well, we had the text of the law written on these standing stones. The divine name is like the main vehicle, communicable vehicle for divine agency. So let's take these texts, and the divine name is all over them, and they can be the material media, the material objects that manifest the divine presence. And this comes up in a few different ways, but in later periods you have the phylacteries and the mezuzot, which take important Torah texts that include the divine name and as well as first-person divine speech, and shrink them down, miniaturize them, put them inside little containers, like tiny little miniature temples, and then you put them at your doorway or you carry them on you, just like anciently people would with divine images. So that's a long, long way time to explain that. Basically what the Hebrew Bible is doing is saying we need divine images as well to feel like God's presence is with us, but the way they do it is bad, so we're going to come up with different ways to do it. And because
that doesn't seem like ancient Israelites.
It's really one of the most successful campaigns of boundary maintenance and identity formation that has ever existed. It's the only one that is still being carried on to this day for thousands of years. And
hi, friends. Apologies for the abrupt cutoff with this interview. Dan and I had planned to do this in 2 parts, which we did. But it was at this moment that his child started screaming in the other room. She had accidentally pinched her fingers. And so we just cut it off so that he could go tend to her. But I realized that there was no outro whatsoever. So I hope that you enjoyed part 1 of the interview. I so enjoyed having Dan on. And part 2 will be out shortly. So do what you do, like, subscribe, and as always, thank you so much for watching. Bye.